He thought she had nothing left until 10 Rolls-Royces from the richest black family arrived for her. I love you, but I am very upset today. YouTube is also pushing us down, not showing my stories to you. If you are facing this issue, comment down, and Binta is not well. Please pray for Binta. Let's start with love. Georgina Merritt had learned a long time ago how to walk into a room without announcing who she was. It helped that most people at the gallery that night weren't looking for her. They were looking at the paintings, 12 large canvases by a 26-year-old artist from the Bronx who'd been selling out solo shows in Berlin for 2 years before anyone in New York noticed. The gallery itself was new, tucked into a storefront on 125th Street between a barbershop and a Jamaican bakery, exposed brick and track lighting doing their best to look like Chelsea without the Chelsea rent. Georgina wore jeans. She always wore jeans to these things now, ever since she'd figured out that a woman in a good blazer and worn denim got asked about the art, while a woman in anything from her mother's closet got asked about her family. Tonight she'd come alone on purpose, riding the 2 train across town instead of calling a car, the way she liked to before things like this, a half hour of being nobody, watching the city do what it did, before she had to be somebody's daughter again for the rest of the evening. The gallerist waved her past the check-in table without even glancing at a list. Around her, 20 or 30 people moved through the 3 small rooms in the hush people reserved for art they're not sure they're allowed to have an opinion about. She was standing in front of a canvas, a woman's back bent over a stove, painted in reds so dark they looked almost black, when a voice next to her said, "I keep coming back to this one, and I still don't know if I like it." She glanced over. A man, maybe mid-30s, dark blazer that had clearly been pressed at home rather than sent out, a little frayed at the left cuff where a watch strap had worn through the fabric. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the painting, head tilted, working something out. "You don't have to like it," Georgina said. "You just have to feel something." That's a very gallery opening thing to say. I've been to a lot of gallery openings. He smiled at that, finally turning to look at her. "Preston," he said, and put his hand out like they were closing a deal instead of meeting at a party. "Georgina. Just Georgina. Just Georgina." He didn't push. That was the first thing she noticed. Most men in rooms like this pushed, gently for the rest of it. The last name, the family, the zip code disguised as small talk. Preston just nodded, like a first name was a perfectly complete piece of information, and went back to the painting. "What do you think she's cooking?" Georgina asked, nodding at the canvas. "Something that takes longer than she wants it to," Preston said. "You can tell by the shoulders." It was, Georgina thought, exactly right, and not the kind of thing men usually noticed. "I think I like it because it's not trying to be beautiful," he said. "Everything else in here is trying so hard to be beautiful." "What does that make you?" "Broke," he said, and laughed at his own joke before she could decide whether to laugh with him. "I lease office space for a living. I came because my buddy's cousin knows the artist and there was free wine." It was such an unglamorous thing to admit, in a room full of people quietly performing how unbothered they were by money, that Georgina felt something in her chest loosen a little. "There's better wine in the back," she said. "By the office. Nobody checks." "Now that," Preston said, "is the most interesting thing anyone's told me all night." They spent 40 minutes back there, sitting on folding chairs meant for gallery staff, drinking wine that was, in fact, better. He told her about growing up outside Pittsburgh, about a father who'd worked the same steel-adjacent supply job for 30 years and retired to almost nothing, about moving to New York 4 years ago with 2 suitcases and a friend's couch to sleep on. He talked about the city the way people only talk about places that haven't yet decided to be kind to them, with a kind of stubborn, hopeful contempt, like a bad marriage he still believed could be saved. He asked her almost nothing about herself, and somehow it didn't feel like disinterest. It felt like relief. Nobody had let her just talk about a painting in years. At one point he asked what she'd paint, if she painted, and she said the inside of a subway car at rush hour, all those private faces trying not to touch. He said that was either the loneliest or the most honest answer he'd ever heard to that question, and he couldn't decide which. She found she couldn't either. She told him she worked with her hands, in a way that was true enough. She did the final walkthroughs on her family's building projects, checked the finish work, argued with contractors about tile grout, without telling him whose buildings they were. By the time she left, she'd given him her number and a version of her last name so soft it barely qualified as one. Across the room, Theodora Merritt had noticed her daughter disappear behind the gallery's office door 20 minutes before either of them reappeared, and she'd noticed exactly who she'd disappeared with. Theodora hadn't come for the paintings, though she bought 2 before the night was over, quietly, through the gallerist, because that was its own kind of watching over things. She'd come because the artist's grandmother had once done alterations for Theodora's own mother, back when Strivers Row was still filling up with families who'd fought for every brick of it and some debts you paid by showing up. She watched Preston from across the room before Georgina reappeared, the easy way he held a wine glass like it might be the only thing steadying him, the blazer that had been ironed by a hand that had learned to iron out of necessity, not habit. She watched him laugh at something the gallerist's assistant said, warm and quick, the kind of laugh that made 3 other people turn toward it. She had seen that kind of warmth before. She had married it, in fact, 31 years ago, in a version of herself young enough not to ask what it was covering. She thought of it still sometimes, not with regret exactly. She had built a good life on the other side of that lesson. But with the tired weight of a woman watching the opening chapter of her own story get read aloud by someone she loved more than she loved being right. When Georgina came to find her near the coat check, cheeks a little flushed, trying and failing to look like a woman who hadn't spent 40 minutes hiding behind an office door, Theodora only said, "Good show tonight." "It really is," Georgina said. "You should see the 3rd room." "I saw it." Theodora studied her daughter's face a moment longer than the sentence required. "Who was that?" "Just someone." "Preston. He leases office space." Theodora buttoned her coat. "Does he know who your mother is?" He didn't ask. "That's not the same question, baby." Georgina laughed it off in the car, the way she'd been laughing off her mother's quiet warnings since she was 14 years old, and Theodora let her, because there was nothing yet to actually warn her about, just a feeling, old and precise, the kind that came from 31 years of watching men in good but not good enough blazers work a room like they'd been born knowing how. At the brownstone, under the porch light that had burned the same warm gold since Georgina was a girl learning to ride a bike on the row, Theodora kissed her daughter's cheek and said only, "Bring him to dinner sometime. Let us all get a look at him." It sounded like an invitation. It was closer to a summons. Georgina's father was in Lagos that week, closing something he wouldn't discuss over dinner even when he was home, and some part of Georgina was relieved he wasn't there yet to weigh in. Relieved and a little ashamed of being relieved. Upstairs, in the room she'd had since she was 9, Georgina sat on the edge of her bed with her shoes still on and read Preston's first text 3 times. "That was the best 2 hours I've had in this city in a long time. Georgina, no last name, I hope you're real." She was real. That was the whole point of tonight, of every gallery opening and coffee shop and subway platform, where she introduced herself as just a woman who liked art and worked with her hands. For a few hours, she'd gotten to be exactly that. Nothing more, nothing owed. She thought about the version of the evening her mother would eventually hear, filtered, incomplete, missing the 40 minutes on the folding chairs, and the version she was keeping for herself, which was really the only version that had happened. She typed back, I'm real. Ask me again sometime and I might tell you my last name." 3 dots appeared almost instantly. She smiled at her phone in the dark, and downstairs, if she'd been listening, she would have heard her mother already on the phone, giving a careful, familiar voice and name, and asking gently to find out everything there was to know. Chapter 2. Judge him by his heart. 6 weeks in, Preston still didn't have her last name, and Georgina had started to think of that as one of the more honest things about them. Every Sunday, without fail, dinner happened at the house on the row at 6 o'clock, and every Sunday Georgina came alone, the way she'd been coming since she was a girl, because Preston didn't know there was a house on the row to come to. He thought she rented a walk-up in Inwood. She let him think it, the same way she let him think a lot of small, harmless things, each one a brick in a wall. She told herself she'd take down eventually, once she knew. 6 weeks had turned out to be enough time to learn the rhythm of him, that he ran 3 miles most mornings before work because it was the only part of the day that belonged entirely to him, that he called his mother in Pittsburgh every Sunday afternoon without fail, even when it meant stepping out of a restaurant to do it, that he'd cried once, telling her about his father's retirement party, 6 co-workers and a sheet cake for 31 years of work, and then apologized for crying like it was a debt he now owed her. 6 weeks was not very long. It had felt so far like enough. Tonight, the table was set the way it always was on Sundays. Her grandmother's good china, the water glasses filled exactly 2/3, her grandfather at the head with his tie already loosened by the time she walked in, Garrison at the other end reading something on his phone he clearly wasn't supposed to be reading at the table. Theodora was in the kitchen, which was never a good sign. Theodora only cooked herself, instead of letting the kitchen staff finish it, when she had something to say and wanted her hands busy while she said it. "There she is," her grandfather said, standing halfway up the way he always did, a courtesy from another era he'd never let go of. "You look tired, baby." "I'm not tired, I'm happy." Georgina kissed his cheek. "There's a difference." Her grandmother across the table didn't look up from her wine. "We'll see." They made it through the salad course on weather and a cousin's law school applications and her grandfather's ongoing feud with his cardiologist. Somewhere in there, her grandmother mentioned, casually, too casually, that a girl from church had just gotten engaged to a surgeon, and Georgina knew even then that the evening had already started without her noticing the starting gun. Georgina had almost let herself relax by the time Theodora set down the last dish, took her seat and said, in a voice so light it was obviously not light at all, "So, tell us about Preston." "There's nothing to tell. We're dating." 6 weeks, Theodora said. "That's something to tell." Georgina put her fork down. "What is this?" Garrison finally put his phone away. That was the second bad sign of the night. "Your mother had someone look into him." The table went very quiet, the quiet of a room where everyone already knows and only one person is finding out. "You had him followed?" "Investigated," Theodora said. "There's a difference, and you know it, because you just made the same distinction about tired and happy 30 seconds ago." "That's not the same thing." "It's exactly the same thing." Theodora slid a folder out from beneath her own placemat, thin and unmarked, and set it in the middle of the table like a dare. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't do it, and I'm not going to apologize for it. I raised you. I get to worry about you the way I know how." Georgina didn't touch the folder. "Say what's in it then, since you clearly want to." 3 relationships in 6 years, all with women who had money or were about to have it. All of them ended the same way. A fight about something small that turned out to be about something large, and him gone within a month of finding out the money wasn't as available as he'd hoped. There was a hedge fund analyst in Chicago, engaged 4 months before he discovered her trust was tied up in litigation that could take years to resolve. He was gone within 3 weeks of that discovery, no explanation beyond a text about needing space. Theodora said it without triumph, which was somehow worse than if she'd said it with any. "I'm not telling you he's a bad man, Georgina. I'm telling you I've seen this shape of good man before." "You've seen it exactly once," Georgina said. 20 years before I was born." The room went stiller. Garrison's jaw did something. Her grandmother set her wine glass down with a small, precise click. "That is not what tonight is about," Theodora said, and for the first time all evening her voice wasn't light at all. Her grandmother leaned forward, rings catching the candlelight. "Baby, I loved a poor man once too, before I loved your grandfather. Broke my own mother's heart doing it. You know what I learned? Poor isn't the sin, poor is just weather. What your mother's folder is describing isn't a man with no money, it's a man with an old, familiar relationship to other people's money, and that is a character trait, not a tax bracket." "You don't know him?" "No," her grandmother agreed. "Neither do you, really. Not the parts that would matter here. You know the parts of him that show up for a woman he thinks has nothing. Ask your mother how the other parts tend to show up once there's something to lose." "This family judges everyone who isn't already inside it," Georgina said, and her voice was rising now, and she let it. "You did it to Daddy's first wife. You did it to Uncle Reuben's whole marriage. Every single time, it's not enough to just not like someone. You have to build a case." "Georgina." Garrison's voice, low, a warning. "No, I want to say it. You raised me to believe I was allowed to want things for myself, and not just for the name. And the first time I actually do that, you hire a stranger to go through his trash." "We didn't go through his trash," Theodora said. "We looked at public records and talked to 2 women who were kind enough to answer honestly, and I would do it again tonight, because I would rather you be furious with me for a year than watch you find out the hard way what I already know." "You don't know it. You're guessing, and you're calling the guess love." Her grandfather, who had said nothing this whole time, finally spoke quietly, the way he did when he actually meant something. "Georgina, sit back down." She hadn't realized she'd stood. "I'm not hungry," she said, and heard how young it sounded and didn't care. "Nobody's asking you to eat," her grandmother said. "We're asking you to think, which you are clearly not currently interested in doing, so go on then. Go be furious somewhere else. We'll save you a plate. I didn't have 2 dimes to rub together when I came calling on your grandmother," her grandfather added before she could turn away entirely. "Her father made me wait in the kitchen the first time like hired help. I've spent 60 years remembering exactly what that felt like, and I still think he was right to be careful, even though he was wrong about me. Being right to be careful and being wrong about the man aren't opposites, baby. They can both be true at the very same time." Georgina picked up her bag from the back of the chair. Garrison caught her arm gently as she passed him, not stopping her, just marking the moment. "For what it's worth," he said, low enough that only she could hear it, "I told your mother to wait until the 2 of you were at least engaged before she did any of this. She didn't listen to me either." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't nothing. At the door, Theodora's voice caught her. Not sharp now, just tired. "I'm not trying to take him from you." "You already tried," Georgina said. "You just did it before he ever got the chance to prove you wrong." She let the door close behind her, harder than she meant to, and stood on the stoop in the cold for a full minute before she trusted her hands enough to call a car. Inside, nobody moved for a while. Her grandfather refilled his wine without being asked, which was its own kind of comment. Garrison stared at the folder like it had personally betrayed him. Only Theodora looked toward the closed door instead of the table, as though Georgina might still be standing on the other side of it, close enough to hear whatever came next. Finally, her grandmother picked her fork back up, considered the folder still sitting untouched in the center of the table, and said to no one in particular, "Well, she got the temper from somewhere." She resumed eating, because in that house, dinner still had to happen, even on the nights it went badly. Especially, Theodora thought, watching the folder no one had opened on the nights it went badly. Chapter 3. Everything I'd Lose Garrison found her 3 days later in the library at the Foundation offices on Lenox Avenue, going through renderings for a community health center the family had been funding since before Georgina was born. The center would open in the spring, 4 floors on a lot that had been a parking structure for a decade before that, and Georgina had spent the better part of 2 years making sure the pediatric wing had windows facing the park instead of the avenue. A detail so small no one but her would likely ever notice it, and important enough to her that she'd once threatened to walk off the project entirely over it. He didn't call ahead. He never did when he actually wanted to talk to her instead of just discuss her. "You're still doing the walkthroughs," he said from the doorway. "Even now. The building doesn't care that I'm angry at my mother." He came in and sat across from her, in the chair he always sat in, the one with the worn left arm from 30 years of him doing exactly this. "I'm not here about your mother." "No," Georgina said. "You're here about you." Garrison didn't deny it. He rarely did, which was, she had to admit, one of the more bearable things about him. "I built the trust structure for this foundation myself," he said. "You know that. What you might not know is I built it, so your name comes off the board the day you marry someone the family hasn't vetted and approved, not the money. The money's yours regardless. Your grandmother made sure of that decades ago. Whatever else happens, but the seat, the vote, the thing you actually care about, unless I've badly misjudged you for 29 years. Georgina set down the rendering. "You're threatening my job. I'm telling you the mechanism. There's a difference, and you're the one who taught your mother that distinction Sunday night apparently, so I assume you'll grant it to me too." She almost smiled, despite herself. "Almost. You built a rule that punishes me for who I love. I built a rule that protects 60 years of work from being handed by proxy to whoever you happen to be in love with in a given year. That's not the same thing, and if you think about it honestly for 1 minute instead of defensively, you'll see it. I don't need the seat. Everyone needs the seat until they don't have it," Garrison said. "Then they need it very badly, usually right around the time they're raising children on a strip mall paycheck and calling their mother collect." "That's cruel." "That's specific," he said. "I can be cruel if you'd prefer it. I'm choosing specific, because I love you enough to actually tell you what this costs instead of just yelling that it costs something. Your cousin did exactly what I'm describing in case you've forgotten. 9 years married to a man who told her the co-op didn't matter, and when it ended, she came back to this family asking for the very thing she'd walked away from at 26. Except now she was 39 and starting from a debt instead of a foundation. You could just trust me. I do trust you. I don't trust 6 weeks. Those are 2 different amounts of trust for 2 different situations, and you're smart enough to know it, even while you're angry at me for saying so." Georgina looked at the renderings spread across the table between them. 2 years of her actual work, argued for line by line against contractors who hadn't wanted to spend the extra on real windows for a building full of people they'd quietly decided didn't need a view. "This building exists because of me," she said. "Not because of the name. Because I sat through 11 zoning meetings and out-argued men twice my age about ADA compliance until they gave up just to make me stop talking. I know. I was in 3 of those meetings. Something in his face shifted, briefly, proud despite himself, before he set it back down like a tool he didn't currently need. That's exactly why I don't want to watch you build the next 15 years of your life on a foundation you never actually checked. He's not a foundation. He's a person. He's a person you've known 6 weeks who doesn't know your last name. That's not a relationship yet, Georgina. That's an audition, and right now you're the only one who knows it's happening. The words landed harder than the folder had, harder than anything Theodora had said at dinner, because there was no cruelty in them at all, just her father's gift for finding the one true thing in a room and setting it down exactly where she couldn't avoid stepping on it. "So what do you want?" she said, "for me to end it?" "I want you to be smart about a good instinct instead of reckless with it. There's a difference." He almost smiled at his own echo of the word. "Your mother wants a folder to decide this. I don't think a folder decides anything, honestly. I think time does. I think if this is real, it survives you being careful. And if it isn't, I'd rather you find that out with your seat on this board still intact than after you've walked away from the family checkbook to prove a point to people who never asked you to prove one." Georgina was quiet for a long moment, turning a corner of the rendering up and back down. "And if I marry him anyway," she said, "without your blessing, without being careful, without any of it?" Garrison looked at her for a long time before he answered, and when he finally did, his voice had lost its edge entirely, gone somewhere quieter and much older. "Then you'll be poor and loved for a while, and that sounds beautiful right now, at 29, in a library with good light and someone else paying the electric bill. Ask me again in 20 years, in a kitchen with a leaking roof, whether beautiful was enough. I've watched that answer change on people I loved, more than once." He didn't say who. He never did. But Georgina had grown up watching her father go quiet whenever a certain kind of wedding photograph came up in conversation, and she had learned, without ever being told directly, not to ask. "That's not going to be us. It's never going to be them," Garrison said, "every single time, before it is." He stood, straightened his jacket, the conversation apparently over on his end, though nothing in her had settled at all. "The seat stays open for you," he said from the doorway, not turning around. "I built the rule. I can also tell you, as the man who built it, that I have never once enjoyed enforcing it. Not on you, not on your cousins, not on anyone. Think about that too tonight, when you're deciding how villainous to make me in your head." "I already know how villainous to make you," Georgina said, but there was less heat in it than she meant there to be. He almost laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, gone as fast as it came. "That's my girl," he said, and left her alone with the renderings and the folder she still hadn't opened. 3 days of untouched paper sitting in her bag like a stone she'd agreed to carry without agreeing to look at. She thought about calling Preston just to hear him say something uncomplicated. She thought about the 11 zoning meetings and the windows she'd fought for, and whether a man who didn't know this building existed could ever really know the parts of her that had built it. She didn't open the folder. She told herself that was the brave version of the evening. For a long time after Garrison left, Georgina sat with her hand flat on the rendering over the pediatric wing's windows, the ones facing the park. She thought about the 2 years it had taken to win that argument, meeting by meeting, budget line by budget line, and how nobody in that building had ever once asked whose daughter she was before deciding whether her argument had merit. It was, she realized, the only room in her entire life where that question had never once come up. It was only walking home, past the health center's dark windows, hers and no one else's, whatever else was true, that she let herself wonder once quickly whether her father had meant to talk her out of Preston at all, or whether he had simply wanted her to walk into her marriage, if she was going to have one, with her eyes fully open instead of grateful ones. She decided she didn't know which. She decided for tonight that not knowing was allowed to be enough. She called Preston anyway, from the corner before her train. He answered on the second ring, breathless, halfway through cooking something that had clearly gone a little wrong in her absence, and asked, the way he always did, plain and unguarded, how her day had been. She told him it had been long. She did not tell him why, and hated just a little how easy the not telling had already become. Chapter 4. One Promise. Preston proposed on a Tuesday, which Georgina would love for the rest of her life, precisely because it wasn't a Saturday, wasn't a landmark, wasn't anything performed for an audience, just the two of them on the fire escape of his fourth-floor walk-up in Inwood, eating dumplings from the place on the corner, when he set the container down and said, without any wind-up at all, "I don't have a ring yet. I wanted to ask before I could afford one, so you'd know it wasn't about the ring." She said yes before he finished the sentence. Afterward, they sat on the fire escape until the dumplings went fully cold, and neither of them cared, Preston running through logistics with the seriousness of a man who had clearly rehearsed none of this and was discovering the shape of it out loud. Where they'd live, whether her landlord in Inwood would let two people stay in a one-bedroom, whether his mother could afford the bus ticket from Pittsburgh on short notice, or whether he should just wire her the money and call it nothing. Georgina listened to him build an entire modest future out loud, brick by careful brick, and said yes to every version of it, and thought, with a small twist of guilt she didn't examine too closely, how strange it was to watch a man plan a wedding around a budget that wasn't real. She didn't tell anyone for 2 full days, which was, for her family, an almost unheard-of silence. She spent those 2 days doing ordinary things with an extraordinary fact sitting underneath them. Grocery shopping, a work call about the health centre's plumbing contractor, a manicure she barely registered getting, turning a question over and over without quite deciding how to ask it. Not whether to marry him. That part had never once wavered. The other part. She told her mother 2 days later, standing in the kitchen on the row at 11 at night, because Theodora was always awake at 11, doing the crossword at the island the way she'd done every night since Georgina was small enough to be carried up to bed, instead of walking there herself. Theodora didn't look up right away. When she did, her face wasn't the face from the dinner table. It was older, softer, and much more frightened. "Sit down," she said. "I need to ask you for something, and I need you to actually hear it before you say no." Georgina sat. "I'm not going to ask you not to marry him," Theodora said. "I tried the other way, in that dining room, and I watched it fail in real time, and I'm not foolish enough to try it twice, so I'm asking for something else instead. One thing." "Okay, don't tell him." Theodora's hands, usually so still, were turning her pen over and over. Not the name, not the house, not the foundation, not any of it. Let him marry the woman from Inwood. If it's real, if what the two of you have is what you think it is, it will survive that. It will survive small before it ever has to survive large. And if it isn't real, baby, I would so much rather you find that out while you can still walk away with your name intact, before there's a ring on your finger that came from someone using it as a key. You want me to lie to my husband for the rest of our marriage. I want you to test it once, honestly, before you commit your whole life to trusting a result you never actually checked. Theodora set the pen down. I did this too. I don't think I've ever told you that. Georgina went still. Your father knew exactly who I was from the first month. I made sure of it. I wanted the safety of being wanted for the whole picture, all at once, no surprises. And it was real what we had. It still is. But I have spent 31 years wondering some nights what I would have found out if I hadn't made it quite so easy for him to know. I'm not saying he married me for the name. I am saying I never gave either of us the chance to find out for certain, and that not knowing is its own small weight I still carry, even inside a good marriage. I don't want that weight for you. I want you to have the certainty I never let myself have. Do you regret it? Georgina asked. Telling him. No. Theodora didn't hesitate. I regret that I'll never know the answer to a question I made sure never got asked. Those are different regrets. I'd like you to have the chance to end up with neither one. And if he fails, Georgina said quietly, if I do this and he turns out to be exactly who Mama's folder said he was, then you'll know before the second decade instead of after it, Theodora said, and you'll know because you were brave enough to actually test the thing you were building your whole life on, instead of just hoping it would hold. Georgina thought of Preston on the fire escape, dumplings going cold, no ring, no wind-up, just the plain fact of wanting her before he could afford to want her comfortably. She thought about how easy it would be to keep him in that plain, uncomplicated place a little longer. She thought, too, about the folder still sitting closed in her bag, 3 weeks now, and what it would mean to finally have an honest answer to the question it had tried to answer for her. A small wedding, then, she said, nothing that would tell him anything. Theodora's eyes filled fast in a way they rarely did. A small wedding. And you don't get to enjoy this, Georgina said, half a laugh breaking through despite everything. You don't get to sit there looking relieved. What you did with that folder is still not okay. I know. Theodora reached across the island and took her hand. I'm still not sorry I looked. I am sorry it hurt you, finding out that I had. That's not the same as sorry. No, Theodora said. It's specific. You'll find you inherited that habit from both of us, unfortunately. They were married 7 weeks later, in the garden of a friend's brownstone 2 blocks from the one Preston still didn't know existed. 19 guests. A borrowed dress Georgina chose deliberately because it looked like something a woman from Inwood could have saved a year to afford. A small trio playing standards under string lights that Preston had hung himself the night before on a ladder he'd borrowed from the Block Association because he didn't yet know he never had to borrow anything from anyone again. The dress had cost $400 at a consignment shop on the Upper West Side, and Georgina had haggled the price down herself, badly, enjoying every uncomfortable second of it, because it was the first time in her adult life she'd had to actually care what something cost. Preston's best man was a guy from his gym who'd known him 11 months and gave a toast about work ethic instead of love, which made everyone laugh harder than a better toast would have. There was no photographer. Theodora's assistant took pictures on her phone, the kind that would end up printed small and kept in a drawer instead of framed on a wall. And somehow that felt, to Georgina, like the truest gift her mother gave her all year. Georgina's family called it dinner with friends when they mentioned it at all, and did not correct anyone who assumed otherwise. Her grandmother wore pearls small enough not to raise a single question. Garrison shook Preston's hand for a long moment, searching his face for something he didn't announce finding one way or the other. Theodora cried through the whole ceremony and let people believe it was only the ordinary kind of crying mothers did. When the officiant asked Preston if he took this woman, he looked at Georgina for a long moment before he answered, like he was making sure, one final time, that she was real, the way he'd been checking in small ways since the night at the gallery. I do, he said. Whoever she turns out to be underneath all this, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give a person, I do. Somewhere behind her, Georgina heard her grandmother's breath catch, quick and quiet, the sound of a woman recognizing something she hadn't expected to recognize. Georgina said her own vows without flinching, and did not let herself think, not once, about the folder still sitting closed in a drawer at her mother's house, or about what her father had said in the library, or about the shape of good man her mother claimed to have seen once before, 20 years before Georgina was born. She thought instead about dumplings going cold on a fire escape, and a man who'd wanted to ask before he could afford a ring, and she let herself for one evening simply believe him completely. Somewhere in the garden, her grandfather was telling Preston's best man a long story about waiting in a kitchen 60 years ago, and Preston's best man was laughing in exactly the wrong places, and nobody corrected him, because some stories are only for the people who already know how they end. It was, she would think much later, the last evening she managed that, without effort. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Watches the House. The apartment was 2 rooms in Washington Heights, a 4th-floor walk-up with a view of a brick air shaft if you leaned out the kitchen window at exactly the right angle, and Georgina had chosen it herself over 3 other places Preston liked better, because it was the kind of apartment a woman who worked with her hands and told small, careful lies about her last name could actually afford. One of the others, a 1-bedroom in Astoria with a dishwasher and actual counter space, had made Preston go quiet with longing in a way that worried her a little even then, though she hadn't yet let herself understand why. "We could swing it," he'd said, doing math on his phone in the elevator down, "if we're careful for a year." She'd told him the commute was too long. It wasn't, really. It was just $400 a month further from what she was actually willing to explain. She could have paid cash for the building. She thought about that some nights, lying next to Preston in the dark, doing arithmetic she'd promised her mother she wouldn't do out loud. They furnished it slowly, on purpose, the way real newlyweds without money had to. A second-hand couch from a listing Preston found at 11 at night. A kitchen table with 1 wobbly leg that Preston shimmed with a folded matchbook and refused to let her replace because fixing it himself had become, in some small unspoken way, the thing he was proudest of in the whole apartment. Georgina let him be proud of it. She was learning, 6 months into this, that letting him be proud of small things was one of the ways she loved him best, and also one of the ways she lied to him most completely. She had not expected marriage to feel like this kind of arithmetic, not the money itself, which she genuinely didn't miss in any way that cost her sleep, but the constant small calibration of what a woman from Inwood would say, would want, would notice. She caught herself, more than once, almost recommending a contractor her family had used for decades, almost mentioning a restaurant she knew only because her father had funded its opening. She was learning her own disguise by wearing it, the way an actor learns a role only fully once the run has actually started, and some nights the effort of it exhausted her more than anything Preston said or didn't say. They fought once, gently, over a lamp. A good one. The kind that would have lasted 20 years, $40 more than the one Preston wanted from the discount place on Dykeman. Georgina let him win. She told herself it was generosity, the kind any wife might extend a husband who cared about a lamp and didn't examine until much later how much of her married life was already becoming an exercise in letting him win small, containable things so she would never have to explain the large ones. The knock came on a Tuesday, 10 days after they'd moved in. Georgina opened the door to a woman in her 50s, sturdy and unhurried, a canvas bag over one shoulder and a look on her face like she'd already decided the apartment needed her before she'd even stepped inside it. "Birdie," the woman said by way of introduction, "your mother sent me. My mother sent you. To help you settle in, curtains, shelf paper, that kind of thing. She said you'd fight me on it, and she was right. I can see it on your face already, so let me save us both some time." Birdie stepped past her into the apartment without quite being invited, the way people do when they've decided the invitation is a formality. "I do this. It's a business. Your mother's paying for it, same as she'd pay for anyone's housewarming gift, and if you send me home, she'll only send someone else next week who isn't half as good at hanging curtains straight." She was, in fact, extraordinary at hanging curtains straight. She was also, Georgina noticed within the first hour, extraordinary at a great many things that had nothing to do with curtains. She knew, without being told, which cabinet to put the good plates in and which drawer would naturally become the junk drawer within a month, regardless of anyone's intentions. She hummed while she worked, something old and wordless that Georgina almost recognized from her own grandmother's kitchen. By the time she left that first afternoon, the apartment looked less like 2 rooms 2 people had recently moved into and more like somewhere people actually lived, and Georgina sensed, with a small, unsettled feeling she couldn't quite name yet, that this was probably exactly the point. It was, Georgina had to admit, a good cover story, good enough that she almost believed it herself some days over the months that followed, even though some deeper part of her knew exactly what Birdie actually was, and what she'd actually been sent to do, and chose, out of some combination of loneliness and self-preservation, not to examine that thought too closely. Preston liked Birdie immediately, which made everything both worse and easier at the same time. He liked that she called him young man and corrected his shelf-hanging. He liked that she brought banana bread on Thursdays for no announced reason. He had no context for old money families keeping people like Birdie on staff for exactly this purpose, so he simply took her at her word, a kind older woman who did this sort of thing, sent by a mother-in-law he'd met twice and found intimidating in ways he couldn't quite name. "Your mom's intense," he said one night, folding the curtains Birdie had hemmed that afternoon. "In a good way, I think. She worries." "About what? You seem like the most put-together person I've ever met." Georgina almost told him then. She felt the shape of the truth rise up in her chest, the whole soft, complicated architecture of it. And then Preston said, in the same easy tone, "Anyway, Devon from work just closed on a place on Central Park West. Can you imagine? 29 years old." And the moment closed itself back up before she'd even decided to open it. "That's nice for Devon," she said. "It's not nice, it's obscene. Nobody makes that kind of money legitimately at 29. He said it lightly, a joke, mostly. But there was something underneath the joke that Georgina hadn't heard from him before. Not quite envy, not quite anger, something adjacent to both. "Must be nice, is all I'm saying. Some people just get handed things. Some people work for things you don't see." "Sure." He folded the last curtain, set it on the stack, didn't look at her. "Sure, okay." It happened again, in a different key, 2 weeks later, when Georgina came home with a bouquet of grocery store flowers, $6, the same $6 as the coffee, because the bodega on the corner had them out front looking bright against the grey afternoon. And she'd wanted, simply, to bring something pretty into their 2 small rooms. Preston looked at them for a long moment, before he said anything. "They'll be dead by Thursday," he said. Not unkind, exactly. Just flat, tired, already halfway to somewhere else in his head. $6 for 4 days? I just wanted flowers, Preston. I know you did." He rubbed his eyes, and for a second, the tiredness in his face looked like something closer to shame. "Ignore me. I had a bad day. They're nice. Thank you." It was, Georgina told herself, an apology, and a real one, and she chose that evening to believe it completely. It was such a small pair of exchanges that Georgina almost let them go entirely, filed it under ordinary marital friction, the kind every couple had about money and other people's money, and the unfairness of a city that showed you exactly what you didn't have on every single corner, every single day. She almost didn't mention it to Birdie, who was in the kitchen wiping down counters that didn't need wiping, clearly in no hurry to leave. "He gets like that sometimes," Georgina said, mostly to fill the silence. "About money. Other people's money." Birdie didn't look up from the counter. "Most people do, baby. It's not like that. He notices things. He works hard, and he notices when other people don't have to." Birdie rinsed the rag, wrung it out with more force than the task required. "I'm sure that's exactly what it is." She said it kindly enough that Georgina let it go, that night, and for several nights after. It was only much later, after the ledger, after Queenstown, after all of it, that Georgina would remember the way Birdie's hands had stilled on that rag and understand that the woman sent to watch her house had in fact already seen everything she needed to see in a single folded curtain and a single lightly bitter joke about a man named Devon, and had simply chosen out of some old and practiced kindness not to say so on the first night it mattered. That first Tuesday, though, none of that had happened yet. That first Tuesday there was only a woman named Birdie standing in a half-furnished kitchen, wringing out a rag with more force than the task required, and a young wife who mistook the silence that followed for tact instead of grief already beginning, quietly, to arrive early. Chapter 6. The Ledger. The fight started small, the way real fights always do, small enough that neither of them could point to a single one afterward and say that's when it began. There was the fight about the electric bill, which was really a fight about whether Georgina ran the air conditioner too much during the day, which was really, underneath that, a fight about whether she took the apartment's discomforts as seriously as he did, since she'd never once, as far as he could tell, actually suffered for anything in her life. There was the fight about her not learning to drive, which had nothing to do with driving and everything to do with a growing list in his head of ways she seemed unprepared for a life he was increasingly certain she'd never actually had to live before him. It was never about the actual dollar amounts. Georgina knew that early, even while she was still pretending mostly to herself that it was. Preston would come home irritated about something at the leasing office, a client who'd walked, a commission that fell through, and by the time he'd taken his coat off, the irritation would have found its way somehow to her. "You didn't have to buy the good coffee," he said one Tuesday, holding up a bag from the specialty place on 181st like evidence. "We talked about this. It was $6, Preston. It's never just $6. It's $6 plus the $6 from last week, plus whatever this month's insurance bump is going to be, and somebody in this apartment has to be the one thinking about the whole picture because it clearly isn't going to be you." She could have ended it in one sentence. She thought about that constantly in the months that followed, how close the truth always sat to the surface of every single fight, how easily she could have set down the coffee and told him there was no whole picture to worry about, that there had never been one, that $6 had never once, in her entire life, been a real number to her. She didn't say it. She had promised her mother a test, and some stubborn, frightened part of her had started to understand that she was no longer sure what the test was actually measuring anymore, him or her own nerve to see it through. His father came up more, that spring, the way old wounds surface when a man is under pressure and looking for a shape to put it in. Georgina learned the story in pieces over several fights, never once as a calm, complete telling. A supply company his father had built from a single truck and a business line, gone in 18 months when a bigger competitor undercut every contract in the county. Preston had been 12. He remembered, he told her once at 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling instead of at her, the sound of his father's voice on the phone with the bank, a register Preston hadn't known a grown man's voice could reach. His mother had gone back to work that same year, cleaning offices downtown before dawn so she could still be home when the school bus came, and Preston remembered, with a clarity that seemed to surprise even him, the smell of her, industrial cleaner and cold morning air, when she climbed into bed beside him some mornings, still in her uniform, too tired to change first. "She never once complained where I could hear it," he said. "I used to think that was strength. Now I think it might have just been shame, and I couldn't tell the difference at 10 years old, and I'm honestly not sure I can tell the difference now." "He got a warehouse job after that," Preston said. "Steel-adjacent supply, 30 years, retired on almost nothing, because the good years never counted toward a pension, only the bad ones did." He was quiet for a while. "I used to think if I just worked hard enough it wouldn't happen to me. Now I think working hard was never actually the variable. I think some people just get to keep what they build, and some people don't, and nobody tells you which one you are until it's already happened to you." It explained him. Georgina knew that lying beside him in the dark, felt it with real tenderness even. It didn't excuse the coffee, or the tone, or the flinch that had started to live in her own shoulders whenever she heard his key in the door. The first lie she caught outright was small enough that she never quite forgot the exact wording of it. He said he'd been at a leasing walkthrough until 9. She'd called the building's leasing office the next morning for a reason that had nothing to do with him, and the woman who answered mentioned offhand that the office had closed at 6. She didn't ask him about it. She filed it, the way she was learning to file things, in a private room in her chest that was getting more crowded by the week. There was a Thursday, not long after, when he came home smelling faintly of a restaurant she didn't recognize. Not their kind of restaurant, something with white tablecloths, good wine, and someone else's cologne clinging to his collar in a way that had nothing to do with the client dinner he swore, unprompted, that it had been. Georgina didn't ask who'd paid. She had started to realize that some questions, once asked out loud, could never be quietly filed away again, and she wasn't ready yet for a fight she couldn't take back. Birdie noticed the room filling. Birdie noticed everything. By then, the new perfume Georgina didn't recognize on Preston's collar one Thursday, faint and expensive and nothing like anything Georgina owned. The phone he'd started keeping face down on the counter, the quality of his cheerfulness on nights he came home late, a cheerfulness that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with somewhere he'd just been. Birdie reported it the way she reported everything, in a phone call from the stairwell where the building's terrible reception forced her twice a month to a woman 4 miles downtown who listened without interrupting and asked every single time whether Georgina seemed happy underneath it. "She seems like a woman convincing herself," Birdie said, that same Thursday, standing in the stairwell with her coat still on. "That's different from happy. I don't know if you want me to keep saying so, but I'm going to keep saying so regardless." Theodora, 4 miles downtown, poured herself a drink she didn't usually pour, 2 fingers of something her own mother had kept for grief rather than celebration, and did not tell Birdie to bring her daughter home. She'd made a promise, too, in her own way, the night she'd asked Georgina to make hers, a promise to let the test run its full course, however much it cost either of them to watch it happen. She drank half the glass, standing at her own kitchen window, looking north toward Washington Heights, as though she could see that far if she just tried hard enough, the phone still warm against her ear. "Does she know?" Birdie asked before she hung up. "That I can hear it in her voice now. The bracing." "She knows something," Theodora said. "She's my daughter. She's always known something before she's let herself know it fully. It's the family curse. My mother had it. I have it. God help her. She's got it worse than either of us, because she's the first one of us to go looking for a way to test it on purpose instead of just waiting to find out." Birdie was quiet on the line for a moment. You could still call this off. Bring her home tonight. Tell her the truth. Let her be angry at you instead of blindsided by him. I could. Theodora looked at the glass again. I think about it every single week you call me, but she asked for this. She looked me in the eye, in my own kitchen, and asked for the chance to know for certain. And if I take that away from her now, to spare myself the waiting, I'm not protecting her. I'm only protecting myself from watching her hurt, which was never actually my job to be spared from. Keep bringing the banana bread, she said before she hung up. Whatever else you do, keep bringing the banana bread. Let that part at least stay simple for her a little while longer. Then she poured the rest of the glass down the sink because grief wasn't useful yet, not tonight, and watched the last of it circle the drain and disappear, and stood a long moment afterward in a house so much larger than the one her daughter had chosen, thinking of her own mother's voice decades ago, offering the same instruction about a different daughter's different unraveling. Keep something simple for her, whatever else you can't fix. She understood it fully now, in a way she hadn't at 29, standing in her own version of that kitchen. Simple wasn't nothing. Simple was sometimes the only thing left to give. Chapter 7. Queenstown Georgina proposed the trip on a Sunday in April, not because she was naive about what was happening to her marriage, but because she wasn't. She had counted, without quite meaning to, the days since he'd last told her something true and unprompted, the way he used to on the fire escape in Inwood, before any of this had a name. The count had reached 11. 11 days of careful, adequate marriage, functional in every visible way, and utterly hollowed out underneath, and Georgina had known, somewhere around day 9, that she was either going to fight for whatever was left or watch it finish dying by inches, and she had never once, in 29 years, chosen the second option when the first was still available to her. She had spent 3 months watching something erode in small, deniable increments, and she had reached the point every person in a failing thing eventually reaches, the point where doing nothing had become its own unbearable decision. She had thought about a dozen smaller interventions first: a date night, a real conversation, the folder still sitting unopened in her drawer like an unlit fuse, and rejected all of them for the same reason. They were things she could attempt without him fully choosing to meet her halfway. A trip required his yes. It required him to want the same rescue she wanted, and some frightened, hopeful part of her needed to know before anything else whether that wanting was still mutual. New Zealand, she said, sliding her laptop across the kitchen table, the flights already searched, the dates already circled. 2 weeks, just us, no leasing office, no family, no— She almost said Birdie, caught herself. No distractions. Preston looked at the screen for a long moment. This isn't cheap. I've been saving. It wasn't even a lie, technically, which was its own small, bitter comfort. I want to do this. I want us to remember why we did any of this in the first place. Something moved across his face. Surprise, maybe, or something closer to relief. The look of a man who had also felt the erosion and hadn't known how to say so first. Yeah, he said. Okay, yeah, let's do it. They flew out on a Thursday, 31 hours of transit that should have exhausted whatever was left of the goodwill between them, and instead did the opposite. Something about the sheer distance, the plain, physical fact of being as far from New York as it was possible to get without leaving the planet entirely, seemed to loosen something in both of them. Preston fell asleep on her shoulder somewhere over the Pacific, and Georgina sat very still for 2 hours so she wouldn't wake him, and thought, watching the little plane icon crawl across the seatback map, that she couldn't remember the last time she'd wanted this badly to protect something. She thought, too, about all the times she'd flown this same ocean before, first class, alone, or with her parents, never once having to calculate whether a checked bag fee mattered. She hadn't told Preston that this was not, technically, her first trip to this part of the world. It hadn't seemed relevant in the moment she'd booked it. Now, watching him sleep, his mouth slightly open, one hand still loosely holding hers even unconscious, it seemed like exactly the kind of small omission that made up the whole shape of her marriage. Not lies, precisely, just silences she'd learned to live inside so comfortably she sometimes forgot they were there at all. Queenstown, when they finally landed, looked like a place designed on purpose to make people forgive each other. Mountains that seemed to have been arranged rather than formed. A lake so clear and so cold it looked like a held breath. Air that smelled like nothing Georgina had ever smelled in New York, pine and snowmelt and something clean underneath both. The first 2 days were, without qualification, good. They rented bikes and got lost on purpose along the lake path, arguing cheerfully over a map neither of them could read correctly. Preston tried bungee jumping off a bridge outside town and came back up laughing so hard he could barely tell her about it, and Georgina watched him from the platform, this ordinary, unguarded joy written plainly across his face, and let herself believe, for the length of that laugh, that the version of him from the last 3 months had been a temporary thing, weather rather than climate. They ate a terrible, wonderful meal at a pub that smelled like fryer oil and good beer, and Preston told her unprompted that this was the first vacation he'd taken in his entire adult life that wasn't secretly a networking trip in disguise, and thanked her for it in a voice so plain and unguarded that Georgina had to look away from him for a second, out at the lake, so he wouldn't see what it did to her face. He talked that night about wanting to start his own leasing firm eventually, small at first, just him and maybe one other agent, built slow and clean instead of chasing someone else's commission structure for the rest of his career. It was the first time he'd talked about the future in front of her without a current of resentment running underneath it, and Georgina let herself imagine, for the length of that one dinner, an entire, uncomplicated life built on the other side of this trip. His firm, her name finally spoken plainly between them, no folder, no ledger, no watching woman in their kitchen twice a week. She did not let herself imagine how she'd explain, in that uncomplicated life, where the seed money for his firm might eventually, quietly, need to come from. They hiked partway up a trail above the lake on the second afternoon, stopping when Georgina's legs gave out with a laugh instead of a complaint, and sat on a flat rock eating trail mix Preston had assembled himself proudly from a supermarket that didn't have half the ingredients he'd wanted. He picked the raisins out of hers without being asked because he'd learned months ago that she hated them. And Georgina thought, watching his hands work through the little bag, that this was the truest evidence she had of anything. Not a folder, not an investigator's report, just a man remembering what she didn't like and quietly removing it before she noticed it was gone. They wandered the Saturday market by the lake that same afternoon, and Preston bought her a small carved wooden bird from a local artist's stall, $9 New Zealand, careful with the conversion on his phone before he handed over the cash, and told her, with the seriousness he reserved for things that actually mattered to him, that it reminded him of something steady. "You always look like you're about to fly off somewhere I can't follow," he said, turning it over in her palm. "I wanted you to have something that stays." She kept the bird on the nightstand of the rented cottage for the rest of the trip, and later, back in New York, on a shelf in the apartment neither of them ever discussed getting rid of, even after everything. On the second night, in the small rented cottage outside town, he pulled her onto the narrow bed and held her the way he had in the very beginning, before any of it, before the coffee and the perfume and the phone kept face down on the counter, and Georgina let herself stop keeping the ledger just for that one night and be only a woman on the other side of the world with a man she still, despite everything, loved without reservation. "I feel like myself again," Preston said into her hair in the dark. "I don't know exactly when I stopped, but I feel like myself again. Here." She wanted so badly to believe the trip had already worked, that whatever this was, they could walk it back to shore just by being far enough away from the life that had started to wear it down. She almost did believe it, lying there in the dark, his heartbeat slow and steady under her ear, his hand still faintly smelling of pine sap from the trail. It was only much later back in New York, turning this exact night over and over, the way she would eventually turn over everything from this trip, that Georgina would remember the phone. It had buzzed once, face down on the nightstand, sometime after midnight, and Preston had reached for it without fully waking, silenced it with a practiced, unconscious motion, and settled back against her as though nothing at all had happened. She hadn't thought anything of it that night. There was so much later that she would learn to see only in hindsight, a whole second version of this same trip, running underneath the one she had actually lived, invisible until she knew exactly where to look for it. She would learn eventually that Queenstown had not been chosen entirely at random by either of them, that a version of this same trip with someone else had apparently been discussed and quietly shelved months earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with budget. She would learn that the phone he'd silenced so smoothly that night already had a name attached to it, a name she still, even now, refused to let herself hold on to for longer than a single sentence at a time. But that was later. That night, in the cottage outside Queenstown, with the mountains black against a sky more full of stars than she had ever seen in her life, Georgina slept better than she had in months and woke for a few more hours, still entirely happy. Chapter 8. What He Left Behind. They were 11 days into the trip when Milford Sound happened, which was long enough that Georgina had almost let herself believe the first 2 good days had reset something real between them, instead of simply delaying whatever the trip had always actually been for. The drive out of Queenstown took nearly 4 hours through Fiordland National Park, mountains rising so steep and close on both sides that the road felt like it had been cut through the middle of something ancient and reluctant to let people pass. The days since Queenstown's first bright weekend had gone quietly strange in ways Georgina kept explaining to herself as jet lag, or homesickness, or the ordinary friction of 2 people spending every hour together for the first time in their marriage. Preston had started taking calls outside, on hotel balconies and hostel porches, phone pressed close to his ear, even when the reception was terrible enough that he had to repeat himself 3 times. She had not asked who. She had told herself each time that she would ask tomorrow, and tomorrow had a way of becoming a version of today she'd rather not examine too closely. Preston's phone had been buzzing since breakfast, a rhythm he kept silencing with a thumb that had gotten too practiced at the motion, and by the time they reached the Homer Tunnel, he'd stopped pretending to enjoy the scenery at all. "Everything okay?" Georgina asked at a lookout point, watching him stare at a blank screen like it might still have something to say to him. "It's fine. Work stuff. On a Sunday. Some of us don't get to leave work behind just because we're on vacation, Georgina." He said her name the way he'd started saying it lately, in arguments, like a word he was setting down hard on purpose. "Some of us actually have to think about money while we're spending it." She let it go. She had gotten good over the past several months at letting things go, filing them into the same crowded room in her chest that never seemed to run out of space. The boat cruise through the Sound should have fixed everything, or at least postponed the reckoning a while longer. It was, without argument, one of the most beautiful things Georgina had ever seen, sheer black cliffs dropping straight into water so still it held the mountains twice, waterfalls coming down out of low cloud like something biblical, a pod of dolphins running alongside the boat for 10 full minutes, while 40 strangers cried out in delight in half a dozen languages. A crew member, young and sunburned, pointed out a waterfall with a name Georgina couldn't quite catch over the wind and told them, grinning, that the water was cold enough to stop a person's heart if they were foolish enough to swim in it. Georgina thought, distantly, that there was something almost funny about traveling 14,000 miles to be warned about cold water by a stranger when she'd been standing in colder water than that, metaphorically, for the better part of a year. Georgina cried a little herself, unguarded, forgetting for a moment to check whether Preston was watching. He wasn't. He was on the upper deck, phone held at an angle she recognized immediately as a man trying to read a text without anyone reading it over his shoulder, and something in Georgina simply broke open, quietly, without her quite deciding it would. "Who is she?" she said, coming up beside him, not loud, not yet, just certain. "Excuse me? Please don't do the confused face. I've watched you do the confused face for months, and I'm so tired of pretending it works on me." It happened fast after that, the way these things always do once the first true sentence gets loose. He didn't deny it, not exactly. He did something worse, which was pivot immediately to blame, his voice climbing with each sentence until the German family 2 feet away had stopped pretending not to listen. "You want to talk about who's been lying," he said. "You've spent our entire marriage acting like I should be grateful for scraps. You think I don't notice how careful you are with money that should be ours? You think I don't notice how you flinch every single time I ask a real question about your family? I don't even know who I married, Georgina. I don't think I ever did. That's not—" "I gave up everything for this," he said, his voice cracking on the word everything in a way that might have moved her once before she realized what he actually meant by it. "I could have married someone who was honest with me from day one. I chose you, and you've spent 2 years making me feel like I should apologize for existing next to your money, except you don't even have any, do you? You've just got the attitude of someone who thinks she does." The boat had gone very quiet around them. Georgina became aware distantly of the captain's assistant hovering near the stairwell, unsure whether to intervene. "I want to go back to the hotel," she said, as steady as she could make it. "Fine." They didn't speak again until the parking lot at the visitor center 3 hours later, where their rental car sat alone under a sky that had gone the flat grey that comes right before real rain. Preston stopped at the driver's door and didn't open it. "Give me the keys," Georgina said. "I'm driving." "You've been drinking since the boat." "1 beer." He was already in the driver's seat. "Get in the car, Georgina." She thought about arguing further. She thought about 100 things, standing in that parking lot with the wind coming down off the mountains hard enough to make her eyes water, and what she actually did was open the passenger door and get in, because it was starting to rain, and because some exhausted, defeated part of her still believed this was recoverable if she could just get them both somewhere quiet enough to talk. He didn't drive back toward Queenstown. He drove 11 minutes down the access road to a small gravel turnout with a view of nothing in particular and stopped the car and told her to get out. "What? Get out? I need space. I'll come back for you." "Preston, this is insane. We're in the middle of—" He was already reaching across her, opening her door from the inside, and before she fully grasped what was happening, he had her bag out of the footwell too, tossed it onto the gravel beside her, her passport and her phone both zipped inside the front pocket where she always kept them. "I'll come back," he said again, not quite looking at her. "I just need an hour." He didn't come back. Georgina stood on that gravel turnout for 40 minutes before the rain made standing there any longer impossible. And by then, the last of the light had started going out of the sky, and there was no cell signal, and no other car had passed in either direction, and she understood, with a clarity that arrived strangely calm compared to everything her body was doing underneath it, that this was no longer a fight. This was the actual shape of things. She found her passport still zipped in her bag. She did not find her phone or her wallet, and she would realize only later, replaying it, that he must have taken both from the outer pocket in the same motion that returned the bag to her. A small, deliberate cruelty dressed up as an accident. She started walking back toward the main road in the rain, in hiking boots that were not made for 11 kilometers, and she did not cry. Not yet, because crying was going to require a kind of stopping she couldn't afford until she'd found another human being. She counted her steps for a while, a habit left over from childhood, from a mother who taught her that counting things was sometimes the only way through a feeling too large to hold all at once. She counted to 400 before she lost the thread of it entirely, somewhere around a bend in the road where the trees opened up just enough to show her how completely alone she actually was. Mountains on every side, no lights anywhere, rain coming down steady and indifferent. She knew in that moment, more clearly than she'd known anything in 2 years, that whatever she had been protecting by staying silent had already cost her more than the money it was meant to protect. It was almost 2 hours before a park ranger's truck found her on the shoulder of the access road, soaked through, and even longer before she was warm and dry inside the Tianao visitor station, wrapped in a ranger's spare jacket, using a borrowed office phone to call the one number she still knew by heart. The ranger, a broad, unhurried woman who introduced herself only as Kath, sat with her the whole time, refilling her tea without being asked, and it was Kath's own laptop, finally, that let Georgina check her email for the first time in 11 days. There were 14 messages from people she knew. The subject lines told her everything before she opened a single one. "Are you okay? Just heard from Preston. Call me. I can't believe you'd just leave him like that." He had landed in Auckland 6 hours earlier. He had already, in that time, called at least 4 mutual friends, and according to the last message in the chain, a lawyer. Georgina sat very still in the ranger station, tea going cold in her hands, and understood that somewhere over the Pacific a version of this story had already started without her, and that she had exactly no way, from a visitor centre in rural New Zealand, to stop it from continuing to spread. Chapter 9. The Family Comes. The number she called from Kath's office phone was not her mother's cell. She'd known with a strange clarity, even in the middle of everything else, that Theodora wouldn't have anywhere quiet enough to hear it ring on a Tuesday afternoon. She called Birdie instead. Birdie picked up on the first ring, the way she always did, as though she'd been sitting with the phone in her lap for 11 days, waiting for exactly this call. Georgina had not expected the sound of that voice to undo her so completely after everything else that had already happened that day, but it did. Something in her chest simply gave way at baby, the same word Birdie had used the very first afternoon in the Washington Heights kitchen, and Georgina had to press the back of her hand hard against her mouth for a moment before she could make herself speak at all. Baby. Just that at first. Then steadier. "Where are you? Tell me exactly where you are, and don't leave anything out, not even the parts that embarrass you," Georgina told her. All of it, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, flat and factual. The gravel turnout and the missing phone and the 14 emails and the lawyer Preston had apparently already called. Birdie didn't interrupt once. When Georgina finally stopped talking, there was a silence on the line, just long enough for her to hear, faintly, a door closing somewhere in the background, and Theodora's voice, low and urgent, asking Birdie something Georgina couldn't make out. "Your mother's here now," Birdie said. "She wants you to know something before anyone does anything else. She wants you to know she's not going to say it. Not tonight, not ever, not one word of it. She just needs you to hold on to your phone, Kath's phone, whoever's phone, for the next 4 hours, because there's about to be a great deal of noise on your end, and none of it needs explaining. Just let it happen." The noise arrived exactly as promised. A car for Georgina within the hour, arranged through a number Kath recognized on sight and treated with a deference that told Georgina everything about what her mother had already set in motion. Later, she would piece together the full shape of it. A call from Birdie to Theodora, Theodora to Garrison, Garrison to a security firm the family had used for 3 generations, a jet requested and fueled and in the air within 90 minutes of Georgina's own call ending. Nobody asked her permission for any of it, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Georgina didn't want to be asked. There was a real relief in being moved through the world by people who loved her enough not to wait for her to catch up to her own rescue. A hotel in Queenstown by nightfall, a suite with someone already inside it, a woman from the consulate's honorary office, gentle and brisk in equal measure, walking Georgina through emergency travel documents with the practiced patience of someone who did this exact thing more often than the general public would ever guess. A new phone, activated and loaded with exactly 1 contact, waiting on the nightstand when Georgina finally sat down. She didn't call Preston. She knew, somewhere in the numb middle of that night, that she was never going to call Preston again, and that the knowing itself, arriving so simply, was its own kind of answer to a question she'd spent 2 years too frightened to actually ask. The flight home took 18 hours, and Georgina slept for 11 of them, in a seat that reclined flat, under a blanket someone had thought to have monogrammed, decades ago, with initials that weren't quite hers anymore. She woke once, somewhere over the Pacific, to find the cabin lights dimmed and a flight attendant quietly refolding the blanket around her shoulders without waking her fully, and Georgina lay there in the dark for a long time afterward, not sleeping, just breathing, watching the small red light blink on the wing outside her window, thinking about nothing at all, which was its own kind of mercy after 2 years of thinking about everything. Garrison met the plane himself at a private terminal in Teterboro and said nothing at all for the first several minutes, just held her in a way she couldn't remember him doing since she was small enough to be carried. "I'm not going to say it," he said finally into her hair, echoing Birdie's promise from half a world away. "I want you to know how hard I'm not saying it. You can say it a little." "No," Garrison said, "I really can't. I built a rule once about protecting what we've worked for, and I stand by every word of it, and I have never in my life wanted less to be right about anything." "How did you know?" Georgina asked into his shoulder. "That night at dinner, how did you actually know and not just guess?" Garrison was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know. Your mother's the one who knew, or thought she did. I just knew I'd rather lose a fight with my daughter than watch her lose something she couldn't get back. Those aren't the same kind of knowing, and I want you to understand the difference because I think you're going to need it going forward. More than you need an apology from me." "What's the difference?" "One of them makes me right. The other one just means I loved you enough to risk being wrong out loud in front of witnesses at your own dinner table." He pulled back enough to look at her properly for the first time since the terminal. "I'd take that trade again, every single time." Theodora was waiting at the house on the row when they arrived and said almost nothing at all. No lecture, no folder pulled back out for a final vindicated word, just a long embrace in the front hallway, and eventually a bowl of the same soup she'd made when Georgina was small and sick and needed exactly one thing from the world, which was simply to be fed by someone who loved her without conditions attached. They didn't discuss New Zealand that night, or the folder, or any of it. Theodora asked about the flight and the weather, and whether Georgina was hungry, and let the rest of it wait for a day when Georgina had slept in her own bed and could stand to hear any of it spoken aloud. The divorce took 4 months, and Georgina signed everything Preston's lawyer put in front of her without contesting a single line. No alimony, no claim on anything, because there was nothing of his worth taking, and she had no interest in fighting over what little there was. Her own lawyer, a quiet, precise woman from the family's usual firm, tried once to argue for at least covering Georgina's own legal fees. "Let it go," Georgina told her. "I don't want anything from him. I want it finished, cleanly, on paper, the way everything in this family gets finished." There was a single moment near the end of the process when Preston's lawyer requested a call. Not a negotiation, just, apparently, a message Preston had asked to be relayed, word for word. Georgina let her own lawyer read it to her once in a conference room on the 11th floor and did not ask to hear it a second time. It was an apology of sorts, or the closest thing he seemed able to construct to one, full of the word love and empty of the word sorry. And Georgina signed the final settlement 3 days later without responding to it in any way at all, because some messages, she was learning, didn't require an answer to be fully received. She went back to the foundation on a Monday morning in September, 11 months after the wedding she'd deliberately kept small enough to fit 19 guests. Garrison had reinstated her name to the board the day she landed, without being asked, but Georgina asked him to hold it. Not forever, she said, just for now. She wanted a desk instead. She wanted the 11 zoning meetings again, the arguments about window placement, the part of the work that had never once, in 2 years of lying about her own name, required her to explain herself to anyone. A desk, Garrison repeated like he was tasting the word. You could have the whole floor. I know. I want the desk. He studied her for a long moment, the way he had in the library over the renderings, more than 2 years earlier now, looking for whatever it was he always seemed to be looking for in her face. This isn't about punishing yourself, he said. I need to hear you say you understand that. A desk isn't a penance. I know that. Do you? I want to earn the floor back, Georgina said, not because I think I have to, because I want to know this time that it's actually mine. He gave her the desk. It was, she would think later, the first entirely honest request she had made of her family in over 2 years, and something in her settled the moment he agreed to it. Not healed, not yet, but settled, the way a house settles after a storm, quietly finding its true weight again in the ground. Chapter 10. 10 cars. Preston's unravelling took the better part of a year, and Georgina heard about most of it the way you hear about weather in a city you used to live in. Second-hand, from people who still knew people, arriving without her ever having to ask. She heard, at various points and from various sources, that he'd tried to get back into his old social circle and found the door quietly closed in ways nobody bothered explaining to him. She heard that he'd started drinking more than he used to, though she couldn't have said whether that detail was true or simply the kind of thing people said about men whose lives were visibly coming apart, true or not, because it fit the shape of the story better than any alternative would have. The woman from his office left him first, sometime in the winter, for reasons nobody Georgina knew seemed entirely clear on, though the going theory, relayed to her second-hand at a dinner she barely remembered attending, was that the whole affair had run on the oxygen of being someone's secret, and once there was nothing left to be secret from, it had simply stopped being interesting to either of them. He lost the apartment in Washington Heights not long after that, the one Georgina had chosen, the one with the wobbly table leg he'd been so proud of fixing, and moved twice more within the year, each address a little further from the version of himself he'd tried so hard to build in front of her. Georgina, meanwhile, had spent those same months exactly where she'd asked to be, at her desk, On the fourth floor of the Foundation's offices, working her way slowly back toward the board seat she'd asked her father to hold rather than give. It was ordinary, unglamorous work. Permit applications, contractor disputes, the tedium of institutional real estate, and she came to love it in a way she hadn't expected, the same way she'd once loved the walkthroughs because it asked nothing of her except competence. Birdie still came by on Thursdays, though there was no longer a marriage to watch over, and the banana bread had, somewhere along the way, simply become a habit neither of them saw any reason to break. Georgina looked forward to it more than she probably should have admitted to anyone. An hour every week that asked nothing of her except to sit at her own kitchen table and be exactly who she actually was, with someone who had known the truth the entire time and loved her anyway. It was in exactly this ordinary work on an unremarkable Wednesday in April that she first saw the name Kerwin Commercial Realty on an acquisitions target list circulated ahead of a board meeting. A small, struggling leasing firm in Midtown, undercapitalized, bleeding clients, exactly the kind of distressed asset the Merit real estate arm bought twice a year without much ceremony. Georgina read the name 3 times before she was entirely sure. She said nothing to anyone that day. She simply initialed the folder, the way she initialed every folder that crossed her desk, and let it move forward through the ordinary machinery of the company, the same machinery that would have picked it up eventually with or without her. Due diligence on Kerwin took 6 weeks, and it was the firm's own outside auditors, not anyone with a personal stake in the outcome, who found the pattern first. A leasing agent with 2 years of inflated commission claims, client entertainment expenses tied to restaurants that had no record of hosting the meetings described, invoices for site visits to properties that showed no corresponding lease activity. The name on the file was Preston's. Georgina had expected, if this moment ever came, to feel something enormous. She had imagined it, in her lowest months, more times than she was proud of. Some version of triumph, sharp and satisfying, finally arriving to balance an old ledger. What she actually felt, reading his name typed plainly into a spreadsheet cell beside a dollar figure and a date, was closer to recognizing an old photograph of someone she used to know well enough to predict exactly what he'd do under enough pressure. Georgina read the auditor's report once, alone at her desk, long after everyone else had gone home, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was almost nothing at all. Not triumph, not relief, just the quiet, factual click of a door that had needed closing for a long time, finally closing itself. The story broke publicly the same week the acquisition was announced, because that was simply how these things worked. A press release, a few paragraphs in a trade publication, the company's leadership shake-up listed almost as an afterthought beneath the deal terms. It was there, buried in a business section article he probably wasn't even supposed to have access to anymore, that Preston finally learned the name he'd been married to for 2 years. He came to the building on a Thursday in June, the day the deal formally closed, and stood across the street from the Merit headquarters on Park Avenue for most of the morning, according to the building's security detail, who noticed him before Georgina ever did. She saw him only once, through the tinted window of the car as the small convoy pulled up to the curb, her father's Rolls-Royce first, then her mother's, then her own, then the cars carrying the board's senior counsel and the 2 directors who'd flown in from Chicago for the announcement, 10 of them in total, black and unhurried, the kind of arrival that had never once, in her entire childhood, seemed remarkable to her because it had simply always been how her family moved through the world. Preston looked smaller than she remembered. That was the only thought she really had, watching him step off the curb toward her car before a member of the security detail, gently, but immovably redirected him back onto the sidewalk. He said something she couldn't hear through the glass. His mouth was shaping her name, she thought, or maybe an apology, or maybe both at once, the two words probably sounding identical after everything that had happened between them. She thought, for one unguarded second, about rolling the window down after all. Not for him, exactly, but for the version of herself who had once sat on a fire escape in Inwood eating cold dumplings, who deserved, maybe, to hear whatever he'd travelled here to say. The thought passed. It did not feel like weakness, passing. It felt like a door she had already, patiently, finished closing months ago, one auditor's report at a time, long before either of them ever set foot on this sidewalk. She did not roll down the window. She walked into the building beside her father, past a small crowd of employees and board members and 2 city council members who'd come for the announcement, all of them turning toward her with the warmth reserved for someone who belonged exactly where she was standing, and she did not look back at the sidewalk. Not once, not even at the door. Inside, the lobby had been set up for the announcement with the understated grandeur her family favored. No balloons, no banner, just good flowers and better coffee, and a room full of people who had spent decades learning exactly how much noise real power actually needed to make, which was almost none at all. Garrison found her hand once, briefly in the crowd, and squeezed it, and let go. And neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left by that point that needed saying out loud. It was only in the car afterward, alone, headed back uptown, while the rest of the family stayed for the reception, that she let herself feel any of it at all. Not triumph. Not the 10-car satisfaction she might have imagined once in an angrier version of this story. Just a kind of tired, complete quiet, the city sliding past the window in its ordinary grey light, and Georgina Merritt sat back against the seat and watched it go by, and did not think about Preston again for the rest of the ride home.